Right now, a ring of fire is closing around the United States. Not the ring of volcanoes around the Pacific, but a weather pattern. A dome of high pressure so enormous it is bending nearly every storm on the continent around its edges, while it bakes everything trapped underneath. Under the dome, a record-breaking heat wave stretching from the plains to the Atlantic. On its northern rim, day after day of violent storms, hail the size of baseballs and the threat of a derecho. On its southern edge, 10 to 12 inches of rain and life-threatening floods. One single machine, 4 different disasters, all unfolding at once, and all of it timed almost perfectly to the 250th 4th of July. But the most dangerous part of this whole pattern is the one almost nobody is pointing a camera at. If that grabs you the way it grabbed me, take a second to subscribe to the Sky Lab, because connecting these dots every single day is exactly what we do here. And drop a comment to tell me where you are watching from and what the sky's doing where you live right now. Trust me, you are going to want to understand this one before the weekend. Now, let's break this down. Part 1. The ring closes. Right now, as you watch this, a wall is being built around the middle of the United States. You cannot see it. It does not show up as a line of clouds or a front sweeping across the map. It shows up as something far stranger. A circle of violent weather forming around a centre of dead, sinking, suffocating air. Meteorologists have a name for this shape when it appears on their charts. They call it a ring of fire. And over the next several days, this one is going to close around more than half the country, at the exact moment that country steps outside to celebrate its 250th birthday. Let me tell you what we are actually looking at, because the scale of it is hard to hold in your head. A dome of high pressure, a mountain of warm air pressing down from above, is parking itself over the Ohio and Tennessee valleys. At the level where weather forecasters measure the strength of these systems, about 18,000 feet up, the pressure heights are climbing toward 596, even 600 decameters. If that number means nothing to you, hold on to this instead. That is roughly 2 standard deviations above what is normal for this time of year. In plain language, this is not a hot summer ridge. This is a ridge so strong that, statistically, you would expect to see it only a handful of times in decades, and it has chosen this week to arrive. The Weather Prediction Center, which is about as understated and careful an institution as exists in American science, opened its national forecast discussion this week with a sentence it almost never writes. It said, and I am quoting them directly, that a significant, dangerous, and record-breaking heatwave is expected for the central to eastern United States. When the agency whose entire job is to avoid hype reaches for the words significant, dangerous, and record-breaking in a single sentence, you should lean in. Because they are not the kind of people who say things like that lightly. Their entire professional culture is built around restraint, around not crying wolf, around couching forecasts in careful, hedged, probabilistic language so that the public does not tune them out. When that culture sets the hedges aside and writes a sentence as flat and as stark as significant, dangerous, and record-breaking, it is the institutional equivalent of a normally calm person grabbing you by the shoulders. It means the signal in the data was strong enough to override a lifetime of trained caution. That, all by itself, before we look at a single map, is the first thing that told me this week was worth your full attention. And what strikes me watching this come together is how quietly it is building compared to the size of what is coming. There is no single dramatic moment to point a camera at. No hurricane spinning up off the coast with a name and an eye. No wall of approaching clouds. A heat dome is the most undramatic-looking catastrophe in all of weather. It arrives as a string of beautiful, cloudless blue sky days. The danger is invisible, baked into air that looks exactly like the air on a pleasant afternoon. That invisibility is part of why heat is the deadliest weather hazard in the United States in an average year. Deadlier than tornadoes, deadlier than hurricanes, deadlier than floods, and yet the one we treat with the least respect. A tornado looks like a monster, so we run from it. A heat dome looks like a nice day, so we walk out into it. The mismatch between how dangerous it is and how harmless it looks is exactly the gap this video exists to close. So here is the shape of the thing. In the center, under the dome, the air sinks. Sinking air heats up and dries the sky of clouds, and the high pressure traps it all in place like a lid clamped over a pot. That is where the heat lives. Widespread temperatures in the 90s and low 100s, and once you fold in the humidity, a feels-like temperature, a heat index climbing to 105, 110 degrees across an enormous swath of the country. From the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley all the way east to the Atlantic coast, the government's own heat risk maps are shading into their two highest categories, major and extreme. But around the rim of that dome, something else entirely is happening. The same high pressure that bakes the center is steering a fast river of wind around its northern edge, and disturbances ride that river like cars on a track, firing off thunderstorms again and again in the same regions day after day. That is the fire in the Ring of Fire. Hail the size of baseballs, winds strong enough to flatten a tree line, tornadoes, and the threat does not come once and leave, it reloads. Some places in the northern plains and the upper Midwest are staring down severe storms on multiple consecutive days. And on the southern and eastern edge of all this, where the dome's moisture wraps back toward the ground, the rain has already turned deadly. In parts of Kentucky and Indiana, 10 to 12 inches of rain have fallen in 48 hours. As I record this, the National Weather Service is using the words life-threatening flash flooding for towns along the Ohio River. Now, I want you to notice what I just did because it is the whole point of this video. I described a record heat wave, a multi-day severe weather siege, and a flash flood emergency, and I told you they are not three separate stories. They are one. They are the inside, the rim, and the underside of a single, continent-sized machine. Most of the coverage you will see this week will hand you these as if they fell from the sky independently. A hot day here, a storm there. They did not. They are all the children of the same ridge, and once you can see the machine, you can see why all of it is happening at once. But here is the part that almost no one is talking about, and it is the reason I am making this video instead of just reading you a forecast. The danger in this heat wave is not the afternoon. We are wired to fear the blazing noon sun, the triple-digit reading on the bank thermometer. That is the part that feels dangerous. It is not the part that kills. The part that kills is the night. Because across much of this region, for several nights in a row, the temperature is not going to fall. Forecasters are watching for overnight lows that refuse to drop below 80, even 85 degrees. Dozens of records, not for daytime highs, but for the warmest nights ever recorded, are on the table. And a warm night is not a minor inconvenience. A warm night is the mechanism of mass-casualty heat events. I'm going to explain exactly why later in this video, and once you understand it, you will never look at a summer heat wave the same way again. Because the question that should be keeping forecasters up at night is not how hot the afternoon of the 4th of July is going to get. It is what happens to a human body, and to a power grid, and to a city, when the air simply stops cooling off after dark for night after night after night. I want to give you a sense of just how big this thing is, because the maps flatten it, and the flattening fools you. When a forecaster shades a heat risk area across the country, you are looking at a feature that, in real life, stretches from the high plains to the Atlantic surf, and from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border. It is not a regional event that you can drive a few hours to escape. To get out from under it, in many cases you would have to leave the eastern two-thirds of the nation entirely. Tens of millions of people are going to spend the better part of a week living inside the same single weather system, breathing the same trapped humid air, lying awake in the same stubborn warmth at 3 a.m. There is something almost vertiginous about a structure that large parking itself over a continent and simply refusing to move, and the timing is the cruelest part of the whole setup. If this dome had formed in the 3rd week of an anonymous August, it would still be dangerous, but it would unfold quietly with people sensibly indoors. Instead, it is arriving on the doorstep of a holiday that practically requires people to be outside, in the sun, in crowds, for hours, often far from shade and air conditioning, often with a drink in hand that makes dehydration worse instead of better. We have, in effect, scheduled the largest outdoor gathering of the year for the precise days the atmosphere has chosen to clamp the lid down hardest. The collision of those two facts, the pattern and the calendar, is what turns an ordinary dangerous heat wave into something the people who study this for a living are quietly worried about. So here is what I am going to do in this video. I'm going to take you all the way into this machine piece by piece. I'm going to show you exactly what a heat dome is and why this one is so unusually strong. I am going to explain, in plain language, why the nights are the part that actually kills, and I am going to take you back to the 2 American cities that learned that lesson at a terrible price. I'm going to walk the map of the heat with you city by city. Then I am going to take you out to the burning rim, to the multi-day siege of severe storms, to the drowning edge where the flooding has already turned deadly, and finally to the strangest part of all, the question of where this dome goes next, and what it is quietly telling us about every summer that comes after this one. So let us walk into this ring of fire together, all the way to the centre, and find out what is really waiting there. Part 2. What a dome of high pressure actually does. To understand why this particular week is so dangerous, you first have to understand what a heat dome actually is, because the name is doing a lot of quiet work and most people picture the wrong thing. When you hear heat dome, you probably imagine the sun simply shining harder, as if someone turned up a dial. That is not what is happening. The sun this week is no stronger than it was last week. What has changed is the air, and specifically what the air is doing in the vertical, in the up and down that you never see on a flat weather map. Start with the jet stream. High above your head, near where the airliners fly, there is a river of wind that circles the entire northern hemisphere, flowing generally from west to east. That river is the great organizer of our weather. It is the boundary between cold air to the north and a warm air to the south, and when it's healthy it moves along briskly and pushes our weather systems through, a few days of heat, then a front, then a cool down, then the next system. Things move. Nothing gets stuck. But the jet stream does not always run straight. Sometimes it buckles. It develops enormous looping waves, great northward bulges and southward plunges, the way a garden hose left running on the grass will whip itself into big lazy curves. And when those waves get large enough, they can stall. The whole pattern locks in place and stops progressing. That is what has happened here. The jet has buckled into a giant northward bulge, a ridge, over the eastern half of the country, and a deep southward plunge, a trough over the west, and it is not moving. Underneath that bulge, that ridge, the air sinks. This is the part that matters, so let me make it concrete. When air descends through the atmosphere, it gets compressed by the weight of the air above it, and compressing a gas heats it up. It is the same physics as the bottom of a bicycle pump getting warm when you push down hard. The whole column of air under the ridge is being gently, relentlessly compressed and warmed from above, day and night, without pause. At the same time, all that sinking air pushes the clouds out of the sky, which is why heat domes come with brutal, cloudless sunshine. There is nothing to block the sun by day, and nothing to hold a blanket of cloud that might, on a normal night, slow the escape of heat. The dome is both a furnace and a lid. And this dome is an unusually strong one. Remember that number, 596 to 600 decameters, about 2 standard deviations above normal. Forecasters in Chicago described the ridge heights as very near 600 decameters and called it anomalously strong. In Boston, the discussion flagged a temperature reading at about 3,000 feet up of 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and they put an exclamation point on it, right there in an official government forecast, because that value is so far outside what you normally see over New England in late June. When the meteorologists themselves are reaching for exclamation points, the pattern has their attention. Let me make that 2 standard deviations figure mean something, because I keep coming back to it and it deserves to land. When meteorologists say a value is 2 standard deviations above normal, they are speaking the language of statistics, and what it translates to in plain terms is this. If you lined up the strength of this ridge against all the late June ridges in the historical record, this one would sit far out in the tail of the distribution, in the company of only a small handful of the strongest events ever observed for the date. It is not a once-in-a-lifetime, off-the-charts value, the kind that rewrites the record books outright. But it is firmly in rare air, the sort of pattern you might see only a few times across decades of summers. And here is what makes it dangerous rather than merely unusual. The strength of the ridge translates directly into the intensity and the persistence of everything beneath it. The height of the heat, the stubbornness of the block, the depth of the warm nights. A garden variety summer ridge gives you a hot weekend. A ridge 2 standard deviations above normal gives you the kind of week the Weather Prediction Center reaches for the word record-breaking to describe. It is also worth knowing that these heights, the numbers like 596 or 600 decameters, are a measurement of the atmosphere's warmth in a single elegant figure. The height refers to the altitude at which the air pressure drops to a certain level, and warm air is less dense and puffs up taller, So higher heights mean a warmer, more swollen column of atmosphere. When forecasters watch those height values climb toward a record territory, they are really watching the entire depth of the atmosphere bulge upward with heat. It is a clean, single number that captures the whole three-dimensional reality of the dome, which is why they obsess over it, and why a reading near 600 decameters over the Ohio Valley in late June makes them sit forward in their chairs. Now, why has the jet stream buckled and stalled like this? This is where the honest science gets genuinely interesting, and where I have to separate what we know from what we suspect. What we know is the immediate cause. The jet is simply in an amplified, wavy, slow-moving configuration right now, and a strong ridge of high pressure has set up shop over the east, while a trough digs in over the west. That much is plain on every weather model on Earth. What we suspect, and where good scientists are still arguing, is why these stuck patterns seem to be showing up more often. One leading line of research points to the Arctic. The far north has been warming faster than the rest of the planet, and that matters because the jet stream is powered by the temperature contrast between the cold pole and the warmer middle latitudes. Weaken that contrast, the thinking goes, and you weaken the engine that keeps the jet moving briskly. A more sluggish jet meanders into bigger, slower waves, the kind that lock a heat dome in place for a week or more instead of a day or two. This is an area of active, legitimate scientific debate, not settled fact, and I want to be clear about that. But it is the most compelling explanation we have for why a pattern that used to break down in a couple of days now seems willing to sit and grind. It helps to give these jet stream waves their proper name, because once you see them, you cannot unsee them on a weather map. They are called Rossby waves, after the meteorologist who first described them, and they are the great planetary-scale meanders of the jet stream, the north and south undulations that wrap around the entire hemisphere. Most of the time they progress slowly eastward, which is why our weather marches along in a more or less orderly fashion. But under certain conditions they can amplify, growing taller and deeper, and they can slow down or even stall. When the pattern locks into a particularly stubborn configuration, with a high to the north, lows on either side, forecasters sometimes call it an omega block because the shape the jet traces looks like the Greek letter omega, a great upside-down U with a dip on each side. The ridge sits inside the loop of the omega, protected and persistent, and that is precisely the kind of resilient, self-defending structure that bakes a region for a week without relief. Whether or not this particular pattern earns the omega label in its purest form, it is behaving with that same stubbornness, and the underlying physics is the same. I also want to address a question you might reasonably be asking, which is, if the air is sinking and warming under the dome, where did all the humidity come from? It seems like a contradiction. Sinking air should be dry, and in the upper levels it is. But down near the surface, the clockwise flow around the dome is doing something separate and crucial. On the southern and western flanks of the high, that circulation reaches down toward the Gulf of Mexico and drags warm, intensely humid air northward across the country, the same low-level moisture feed that we'll see fuels the storms on the rim. So you end up with a layered atmosphere, hot, dry, sinking air pressing down from above, trapping a shallow, soupy layer of Gulf moisture near the ground, where people actually live and breathe. That trapped surface moisture is what drives the heat index into triple digits and what keeps the nights so oppressive. The dome is dry where the satellites look and wet where the people are, and that combination is exactly the dangerous one, and grinding is exactly the danger. A hot afternoon is survivable. Almost anything is survivable for one afternoon. The reason this pattern is being called dangerous and record-breaking is that it does not intend to leave. The lid is clamped down, the furnace is running, and the forecast keeps it in place from the start of the work week through the holiday, and possibly beyond. Heat is not a sprint that hits you once. It is an accumulation. It piles up in your body, in your home, in the concrete and brick of your city, hour after hour with the relief valve, the cool night, welded shut. It is worth pausing on just how persistent these blocking patterns can be, because persistence is the whole danger. In normal flow, a ridge of high pressure might build over a region, give it a hot day or two, and then slide east as the next trough comes along to knock it out of the way. The system self-corrects. But a true block is different. A block is a ridge that has grown strong enough and large enough to defend itself, to deflect the very disturbances that would normally tear it down, shunting them up and over its top and around its edges instead of through it. It becomes a kind of atmospheric boulder in the middle of the stream, and the water has to part and go around. That is why blocks can sit for a week, 10 days, sometimes longer, while everything around them reorganizes to accommodate their stubbornness. And the storms that get deflected around the edges, those become the fire on the rim that we will get to later. The same stubbornness that bakes the center is what flings the storms around the outside. One feature, one cause, two very different weapons. There is also a feedback loop hiding inside a heat dome that makes it even harder to break, and it is worth understanding because it explains why these things dig in. As the dome bakes the ground beneath it, the soil dries out. Dry soil behaves very differently from moist soil under the sun. When the ground has moisture in it, a good chunk of the sun's energy goes into evaporating that water rather than directly heating the air, which moderates the temperature. But once the soil is baked dry, there is no moisture left to evaporate, so nearly all of the sun's energy goes straight into heating the air and the ground even further. The dome dries the soil. The dried soil amplifies the heat. The amplified heat reinforces the dome. It is a self-feeding cycle, and it is one more reason a heat dome that gets established tends to entrench rather than fade. The pattern, in a sense, builds its own foundation as it goes. Which brings us back to that welded relief valve, the nights. Because everything I have just described, the sinking air, the stalled ridge, the missing clouds, the dried out ground, all of it conspires toward one specific lethal outcome that we are about to look at directly. The dome does not just make the days hot. It steals the nights. And to understand why that is the most important sentence in this entire forecast, we have to talk about what actually happens inside a human body when the darkness refuses to bring any relief. Part 3. The nights that will not cool. Here is a question that sounds simple and is not. Why does a heat wave kill people? You might say because it gets too hot and the body overheats. That is true, but it is incomplete in a way that hides the real danger. Because the truth is that the human body is an extraordinary machine for shedding heat. You sweat, the sweat evaporates, and evaporation pulls heat away from your skin. You can endure a startling amount of daytime heat as long as that system keeps working, and as long as you get a chance to recover. The chance to recover is the whole game, and the chance to recover comes at night. On a normal summer night, even after a scorching day, the temperature falls. The sun goes down, the ground radiates its heat back out to space, and the air cools, often by 20 or 30 degrees. Your body, your house, the bricks of your city, all of it offloads the heat it soaked up during the day. By dawn you are reset, ready to take the next day's heat. That nightly reset is the safety valve that keeps a hot day from becoming a deadly one. Now take that safety valve away. That is precisely what this dome does. With the clouds gone and the air aloft so warm and so heavy, the heat that builds up during the day cannot escape efficiently after dark. And so across much of this region, the forecast is for overnight low temperatures that simply refuse to fall. We are talking about lows stuck in the low 80s, in some places not dropping below 85 degrees. In New York City and northern New Jersey, the forecasters expect the heat index to stay above the low 80s from Wednesday night clear through Friday night, which they describe, in their own words, as little to no recovery from heat stress. Dozens of records are in play across the country, and a great many of them are not records for the hottest afternoon. They are records for the warmest night, the warmest the air has ever refused to cool. Let me make this physical, because this is the center of the whole story. Imagine your body as a bucket, and the day's heat as water poured in. On a normal day, you pour heat in during the afternoon, and then at night you pour it back out, and the bucket is empty again by morning. During this kind of heat wave, you pour the water in all day, and at night the drain is plugged. So you start the next morning with the bucket already half full. The next day fills it higher. The third night, it does not drain either. By the fourth day, the bucket is overflowing, and there is nowhere for the heat to go but to stay inside you. That is heat stress compounding, night over night, and it is the engine of every mass-casualty heat disaster in modern history. This is also where the humidity turns from uncomfortable into something more sinister. Your body's master cooling trick, sweating, only works if the sweat can evaporate, and evaporation depends on the air being dry enough to accept the moisture. When the air is already thick with humidity, as it will be under this dome with all that Gulf moisture streaming north, Your sweat stops evaporating efficiently. It just sits on your skin or runs off, doing nothing to cool you. Your single most important defense against heat begins to fail at the exact moment you need it most. And the humidity does its worst work at night, which is the cruel twist that ties the whole danger together. During the day, even in high humidity, there is at least the chance of moving air, a breeze, some evaporation, the simple ability to seek shade. At night, under a heat dome, the air often goes still. The humidity climbs as the temperature ticks down just slightly toward the dew point, and the sweat that might have offered some relief in a drier night simply pools and does nothing. So the body, already carrying the accumulated load of the day, lies in the dark in still, saturated air, with its primary cooling system effectively switched off. Hour after hour, getting no recovery, when recovery is the entire purpose of the night. This is the precise physiological reason that warm, humid nights, not hot, dry afternoons, are the signature killer of heat waves. It is not a vague correlation, it is a direct mechanism, and you can feel it in your own body on a muggy summer night when sleep will not come and the sheets feel damp and the air feels like a wet blanket. Now imagine that, but worse, for 4 nights running, in a body that is 80 years old. Scientists have a way of measuring this combined threat of heat and humidity together. It is called the wet bulb temperature, and we have explored it before on this channel in detail. The short version is this. There is a theoretical limit, long-cited as a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, beyond which a healthy human being cannot cool themselves at all, even sitting naked in the shade in front of a fan, and will overheat and die within hours. For a long time, that 35-degree figure was treated as the red line, but more recent work, careful laboratory research measuring real young, healthy adults, has found that the true limit is lower, closer to 30 or 31 degrees Celsius in humid conditions, lower than we thought, which means the margin between a survivable heat wave and a lethal one is thinner than the textbooks long claimed. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, the way this channel always tries to be. The heat this week, for most of the affected region, is not going to reach those absolute wet bulb death limits. This is not a forecast that everyone outdoors will perish. That would be fear-mongering, and the data does not support it. What the data does support is something quieter and frankly more insidious. You do not need to hit the theoretical kill limit to die of heat. People die in heat waves at temperatures far below that ceiling, and they die specifically because of the compounding effect. The nights that will not cool, especially when they are old or sick or alone or without a working air conditioner. The absolute limit is the cliff edge, but almost no one actually dies at the cliff edge. They die on the long, gentle slope that leads up to it, the slope made of warm night after warm night. There is a second, quieter reason warm nights are so dangerous, and it has to do with sleep, and with the simple machinery of a human body trying to rest. Your core temperature naturally falls at night. It is part of how you fall asleep and stay asleep. That drop is supposed to be helped along by a cooling environment. When the bedroom never cools below the low 80s, your body cannot complete that nightly dip, and sleep becomes shallow, broken, and unrefreshing. Now stack several of those nights on top of each other. You get a population that is not only carrying accumulated heat in their bodies, but is also progressively sleep-deprived, which degrades judgment, slows reaction, and weakens the very cardiovascular system that is already straining to pump blood to the skin to shed heat. The heart works harder during a heat wave than at almost any other time, and it does that work without the nightly rest it depends on. For a young, healthy person, that is miserable. For an 80-year-old with a weak heart, it can be the thing that ends them, and it almost never shows up in the headlines as a heat death, because on paper it looks like a heart attack. And here is the part that ties the danger directly to geography, to where people actually live. Cities make all of this worse through something called the urban heat island. All that concrete, asphalt, brick and steel soaks up heat through the day far more efficiently than soil and grass and trees, and then it releases that stored heat slowly through the night, keeping the urban core several degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside after dark. So the very places with the most people, the dense downtowns and the older apartment districts, are the places where the nights stay hottest, and they are often the places where the most vulnerable people live, on upper floors, without air conditioning, with windows they are afraid to open. The heat island and the social map of vulnerability line up almost perfectly, and a heat dome presses down on exactly that overlap. The danger is not spread evenly, it concentrates, with terrible precision, on the people least able to bear it. And that is why the overnight temperatures in this forecast matter more than the headline daytime highs. A city can survive a 100-degree afternoon. What a city struggles to survive is the fourth consecutive night when the air never drops below 85. When the apartment on the third floor with no air conditioning never cools down. When the elderly man on a fixed income who's afraid of his electric bill decides to tough it out one more night. That is the scenario this dome is building. Not a dramatic noon catastrophe, but a slow, silent, accumulating pressure that peaks in the dark where no camera is pointed. Let me take you one layer deeper into the body, because understanding the actual physiology makes the danger impossible to dismiss. When you get hot, your heart does something dramatic. It redirects a large volume of blood toward your skin, where the heat can radiate away and where sweat can carry it off. That is a heavy demand on the cardiovascular system. Your heart rate climbs, sometimes by 30 or more beats per minute just to keep up. At the same time, you're losing fluid and salt through sweat, which thickens your blood and drops your blood volume, forcing the heart to work even harder to move what is left. For a healthy young person, the system has enormous reserve and copes. But for someone older, or with heart disease, or diabetes, or kidney trouble, or on certain common medications that interfere with sweating or fluid balance, that reserve is thin, and a prolonged heat load can push the system past what it can sustain. This is why so many heatwave deaths are recorded as cardiac or respiratory, not as heat. The heat is the cause, the heart is just where it lands. And the failure mode at the extreme, heat stroke, is genuinely terrifying in how fast and how completely it can take a person. There is a critical threshold, a core body temperature around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, beyond which the body's own regulation begins to break down. Sweating can stop. The skin can go hot and dry. Confusion sets in, then disorientation, then collapse. And without rapid cooling, the proteins and organs of the body begin to fail, one after another. It can progress from someone feeling unwell to a medical emergency in a matter of tens of minutes. The people standing in the sun at a parade or a ball game this week, especially if they have been drinking alcohol, which dehydrates and impairs judgment, are exactly the population that fills the medical tents when the heat index climbs past 105. The fast path to heat death does not require 4 bad nights. It only requires 1 bad afternoon, and a body that was already closer to the edge than anyone realized. So this week carries both timescales at once, the slow one and the fast one. The slow danger builds across the nights, gathering quietly among the old and the isolated over the better part of a week. The fast danger can strike any healthy person in a single sweltering afternoon of poor choices. Most coverage will warn you about neither clearly. I am asking you to hold both, because they will be unfolding side by side in the same cities under the same dome, and the defences against them, water, shade, air conditioning, and an eye on the people around you, are very nearly the same. So when you see the maps this week, and they show you the angry red blob of 110-degree afternoon heat indices, I want you to do something different from everyone else watching. I want you to ask about the night, ask what the low is going to be. Because that number, the one nobody puts in the headline, is the one that actually decides who makes it to the 4th of July. And to see why that is true, we only have to look back at the times this exact scenario has played out before, in cities that learned the lesson at a terrible cost. Part 4. The cities that learned. This, the hard way. If you want to know what a heatwave with no nighttime relief actually does to a city, you do not have to imagine it. It has happened more than once, and the pattern of who lives and who dies is so consistent that it reads less like a series of accidents and more like a law of nature. Let me take you to 2 of them, because they are the ghosts standing behind this week's forecast. Go back to July of 1995 to Chicago. A heat dome very much like the one forming now settled over the upper Midwest. The afternoon temperatures were brutal, climbing well past 100 degrees in the city. But the meteorologists who studied the disaster afterward fixed on a different number, the nights. For several nights running, the temperature in the urban core barely fell, held up by the concrete and asphalt of the city, which had soaked up the day's heat and radiated it right back after dark. The result was a catastrophe that unfolded mostly out of sight, inside apartments and rooming houses. By the time it was over, the heatwave had killed an estimated 739 people in a matter of days. And here is the detail that should stay with you. The victims were not random. They were overwhelmingly the elderly. They were people living alone. They were people on high floors of buildings with no air conditioning, where the heat collected and never left. They were people who, often out of fear of crime or fear of the electric bill, kept their windows shut and their lives small. The heat did not kill a cross-section of the city. It reached into the most isolated, the most vulnerable, the people no one was checking on, and it took them in the night. A later analysis of the disaster became a landmark study of how a natural hazard finds the exact fault lines of a society and breaks along them. Now jump forward to the summer of 2021 and move to the Pacific Northwest, a place that does not even think of itself as a hot climate. A heat dome of historic violence built over the region, the kind of pattern that by some estimates should occur perhaps once in 1,000 years. We have talked about it on this channel before. The village of Lytton in British Columbia set a Canadian national temperature record of 49.6 degrees Celsius, which is 121 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading you would expect in Death Valley, not in the Green Hills near the Canadian coast. And the day after it set that record, the village burned to the ground. But again, look past the dramatic headline number. In British Columbia alone, the heat wave was associated with more than 600 deaths. And once again, the dead were disproportionately the elderly, the isolated, the people in homes built for a cool climate that had never needed air conditioning, homes that became ovens that would not cool at night. 2 different decades, 2 different corners of the continent, one identical pattern, a stalled dome, brutal days, and above all, nights that would not release their heat, killing quietly, indoors, among the people least able to escape. This is not ancient history or a freak coincidence. It is the signature of this specific kind of event, and it is the reason the forecasters this week keep circling back to the overnight lows. There is a third example worth holding up next to those 2, because it stretches even further back and shows that this is not some new fragility of modern life. Go all the way back to the summer of 1936, in the depths of the Dust Bowl, when a heat wave of staggering proportions settled over the central United States and southern Canada. It came in a decade already broken by drought, when the soil had turned to powder and there was no moisture left in the ground to blunt the sun, the same dried soil feedback we talked about earlier, running at the scale of a continent and a decade. Cities set all-time temperature records that summer that, in some cases, still stand to this day, nearly 90 years later. And without air conditioning, which barely existed for ordinary people then, the nights were inescapable. Thousands died. It remains one of the deadliest heat events in North American history, and it is a reminder that the killing power of a heat dome is not a quirk of the modern era. It is ancient. What has changed is only the baseline it now builds upon, and the number of fragile elderly people living alone in cities for it to find. What every one of these disasters shares, across 90 years, is a grimly consistent profile of the victims, and I think it is worth naming plainly because it tells you exactly who to protect this week. The dead are old, far more often than not. They live alone. They are cut off by infirmity or fear or poverty from the simple acts that would save them, opening a window, running an air conditioner, calling for help, going somewhere cool. They are people for whom the electric bill is a real and frightening number, who will sit in a stifling room rather than run a unit they are not sure they can afford. And they are people no one is checking on, whose absence is not noticed for days. The heat does not pick them because they are weak in some abstract sense. It picks them because the threads connecting them to other people are frayed, and a heat wave is, above almost any other disaster, a test of those threads. Where the threads hold, people live. Where they have broken, people die alone in the warm dark. So let me bring it home to right now, to this week, to the 250th 4th of July. Because the cruel timing of this dome is that it peaks on the one day of the year when the largest number of Americans are deliberately outside. Think about what the 4th of July actually is. It is parades in the open sun. It is barbecues in backyards with no shade. It is people standing on hot pavement for hours, waiting for fireworks that cannot even begin until well after dark, on a night that is not going to cool down. There is a hot dog eating contest in Brooklyn that draws enormous crowds into the direct midday sun. There is a national parade in Washington. Multiply the ordinary danger of a heatwave by the single most crowded outdoor day on the American calendar, and you can see why the people who study this are uneasy. And it is not only the very old or the very sick who are exposed this time. When you put tens of millions of ordinary healthy people outdoors in direct sun, often drinking alcohol, often far from shade or air conditioning for hours, on a day with a heat index near or above 110 degrees, you generate exactly the conditions that fill medical tents: heat exhaustion, heat stroke. The body's cooling system overwhelmed not over 4 days, but in a single afternoon of bad decisions made in a festive mood. The danger this week has two faces: the slow one that takes the vulnerable in the night, and the fast one that can take anyone who underestimates a July sun while celebrating. And there is a particular irony to this 4th of July that I cannot get past. Think about how the day actually ends. It ends after dark with fireworks, which means it requires people to stay outside in crowds, deep into a night that this year is not going to cool down. On a normal 4th, the evening is the reward, the part where the heat finally breaks and a warm night turns pleasant. This year, the evening is just a continuation of the day's heat with the sun removed. People will stand shoulder to shoulder on pavement that has been absorbing sun for 12 hours and is radiating it back up at them, waiting for a show that cannot start until it is fully dark, in air that is still in the 90s at 9 at night. The celebration itself is structured to keep people in exactly the conditions that are most dangerous, at exactly the hours when the danger does not relent. So let me be practical, because awareness without a plan is just anxiety. If you're going to be outdoors this week, and especially on the holiday, the rules are simple and they save lives. Drink water before you are thirsty and keep drinking it, because thirst lags behind dehydration. Find shade and use it, and build breaks in air conditioning into your day rather than toughing it out in one long stretch. Go easy on alcohol, which works against you on every front during heat. Wear light, loose clothing. Know the warning signs in yourself and others: the headache, the dizziness, the nausea, the strange irritability, the moment when someone stops sweating, and treat them as the emergencies they are, getting the person cool and getting help fast. None of this is complicated. All of it is the difference between a celebration and a tragedy, and almost all of the people who end up in trouble this week will be people who knew these rules and decided, in a festive moment, that they did not apply to them today. I am not telling you to cancel your 4th of July. I am telling you to respect it. Build a plan now. Know where the air conditioning is. Know who on your street is old or alone or without a working unit, and knock on their door this week, because in 1995 it was the people no one checked on who did not make it. The single most powerful tool against this kind of disaster is not a government agency. It is a neighbour who knocks. And if you remember nothing else from this video, remember that the danger lives in the night and the defence is each other. Let me be very specific about who to check on, because vague advice helps no one. Think about the people on your street and in your family who fit the profile the heat hunts for. The elderly, especially anyone living alone. Anyone with a heart condition, breathing problems, diabetes or kidney trouble. Anyone on medications for blood pressure or mental health, some of which interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature. Infants and very young children whose bodies heat up faster than an adult's. Anyone without working air conditioning, or anyone who has it but is rationing it out of fear of the bill. Anyone who works outdoors, the construction crews and roofers and delivery drivers who do not get to choose to stay inside. And anyone who is simply isolated, the person whose absence would not be noticed for days. If someone you know fits any of those descriptions, this is the week to make a plan to check on them, in person if you can, by phone if you cannot, every day through the peak. Not once, every day. And the thing to understand is that this kind of attention is not charity. It is the actual proven public health intervention that brings death tolls down. After the great heat disasters, the studies all converged on the same unglamorous conclusion. The single biggest protective factor for an at-risk person was social contact, having someone who checked on them, who would notice if something was wrong, who could get them to a cool place or call for help. Not income, not even by itself owning an air conditioner, because a unit switched off to save money saves no one. The protective factor was a human being paying attention. In a heat wave, you are, quite literally, your neighbour's early warning system, and they are yours. But the heat is only the inside of this machine. To understand the full shape of what is closing around the country, we have to leave the silent baking centre and go out to the rim, where the same dome that is stealing the nights is throwing fire. Part 5. The Map of the Heat. Let me walk you across the country the way this dome is going to be felt city by city, because the geography of it tells you how enormous this single system really is. And as I do, keep the night in the back of your mind, because every one of these daytime numbers comes attached to a nighttime number that will not let the place recover. Start in the middle, along the Mississippi River, because that is where the heat ignites first this weekend before it spreads. In St. Louis, the feels-like temperature is forecast to reach around 111 degrees. That is not the air temperature, that is the heat index, the combination of heat and humidity, the number that actually describes what your body has to fight. 111. And St. Louis sits in a part of the country where the urban heat island effect is strong, where the brick and pavement of the city hold the warmth and surrender it grudgingly after dark. That's exactly why the official forecasts there have leaned toward the most serious heat headlines. Move north into the upper Midwest as the work week begins. Minneapolis, a city that thinks of itself as cold, is looking at a heat index around 108 degrees. Chicago climbs to around 100, with the forecasters there warning of little to no relief at the lakeshore or at night. That phrase again, the one that should make your ears prick up. Davenport around 106. Detroit as the dome shifts around 108. These are not desert cities. These are northern continental places, and they are being asked to endure heat indices that would be punishing in the deep south. Now swing down to the actual south, and here is a twist that surprises people. The deep south this week is, by its own brutal standards, not the worst of it. Places like Houston are looking at heat indices in the range of 103 to 107, which is a dangerous major heat risk, but it is also, for southeast Texas in summer, almost ordinary. The forecasters in Birmingham, Alabama, describe dangerous heat as the main story for a full 7 days, with heat indices reaching 105 or greater. The South will suffer, but the South is used to this. The truly anomalous, record-threatening heat is aimed at the places that are not built for it: the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, the Northeast. Which brings us to the East Coast, where the dome is going to do its most historic work later in the week, Wednesday into Friday and the holiday weekend. In the New York City metro, the forecasters are projecting better than a 75% chance that temperatures climb above 100 degrees on Thursday and Friday, with the odds of breaking 105 degrees approaching 1 in 2. In Philadelphia, an extreme heat watch is up from Wednesday afternoon all the way through Saturday evening, with highs forecast from the mid-90s to as high as 105, and heat index values between 100 and 110 for days on end. Even the 4th of July itself, after the worst is meant to ease, is forecast to stay in the mid-90s to near 100. And in Boston, the discussion flagged that exceptional warmth aloft and put an extreme, level 4 of 4, heat risk on the table for Thursday, especially in the urban core and the river valleys, where the heat pools and stagnates. The Northeast Corridor deserves special concern, and not because the numbers there are the highest in the country, because they are not. It is because of density and age. This is the most densely populated stretch of the United States. Tens of millions of people packed into the corridor from Washington through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York and on toward Boston, much of it in older housing built long before central air conditioning was standard, much of it in walk-up apartments and row homes that trap heat on the upper floors. It is also a region whose population, by simple climate, is the least acclimatized to extreme heat, and whose electrical grid carries an enormous load even on a normal summer day. When you drive a heat index of 105 to 110 into that corridor for several days, with nights that will not cool, you are running the most dangerous version of this experiment, the highest concentration of vulnerable people meeting the smallest margin of preparedness. The forecasters there know it, which is why the language coming out of those offices, words like extreme heat watch and little to no overnight recovery, is as pointed as it is. Down in the mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, the air temperatures alone, before you even add humidity, are forecast to climb toward 105, even 106 degrees in places like Raleigh, which would put the city within striking distance of its all-time record of around 108. Sit with that. Not a record for the date, a run at the hottest temperature ever measured there, period. Let me make sure the heat index itself is clear, because I keep using it, and it is the number that actually matters, more than the air temperature you see on a thermometer. The heat index is an attempt to answer a simple question. What does the heat actually feel like to a human body? once you account for the humidity. The reason it exists is that humidity sabotages your cooling. On a dry day, 95 degrees is genuinely unpleasant, but your sweat evaporates freely and your body copes. On a humid day, that same 95 degrees of air temperature can feel like 110, because your sweat will not evaporate and your body cannot shed its heat. So when a forecaster says the heat index will hit 110 in St. Louis, they are not saying the thermometer reads 110. They are saying that the combination of the actual temperature and the thick humidity will stress your body the way a dry 110 would. It is the more honest number because your body does not care what the thermometer says. It cares how fast it can cool itself, and the heat index is the measure of how badly the humidity has sabotaged that. This also clears up a confusion that comes up every single time, the question of records. You will hear that this heat wave is record-breaking, and then you will look at the forecast highs and think, but those are not the hottest temperatures ever recorded in these cities, and you would be right. Many of these places have hit higher absolute air temperatures in the past. So what is breaking records? Two things, mostly. First, daily records. The hottest it has ever been on this specific calendar date, which is a much lower bar than the all-time record, and is the kind of record that falls in waves during an event like this. And second, and far more importantly, the record warm nights, the highest overnight low temperatures ever recorded, which is the category that almost no one watches, and the one this pattern is built to shatter. When you hear record-breaking this week, it mostly does not mean the hottest afternoon in history. It means a relentless run of dates that have never been this hot, and nights that have never refused to cool like this. That second category is the dangerous one, and it is the one quietly piling up records in the background. Now, I have thrown a lot of numbers at you, so let me pull the camera back. Because the individual readings are not really the story is the totality. As of this forecast, the National Weather Service has hundreds of active alerts across the country, and within them, 11 extreme heat warnings, 19 extreme heat watches, and 39 heat advisories. That is a wall of heat alerts stretching across the eastern two-thirds of the nation, all at once, all driven by the same dome. The heat risk maps shade into major and extreme from the plains to the Atlantic. This is not a regional hot spell. This is most of a continent placed under a single, slowly tightening lid. And every one of those daytime numbers, I will say it one more time because it is the spine of this whole story, comes chained to a night that will not cool. The 111 in St. Louis is followed by a night in the low 80s. The Philadelphia heat index of 110 is followed by a night with no recovery. The map of the heat is really a map of stolen nights, and the longer the dome sits, the deeper that debt grows. I want to dwell for a moment on why the northern and eastern cities are the ones in real, record-threatening danger, while the deep south, which will be hotter in absolute terms, is closer to business as usual. It comes down to adaptation, both human and physical. A city like Houston or New Orleans is built for this. Nearly every home, every store, every bus has air conditioning. The population is acclimatized, their bodies physically adjusted to working in heat. The infrastructure, the power grid, the emergency services, all of it is sized and rehearsed for triple-digit summers. Now contrast that with a city like Boston, or Detroit, or the older neighborhoods of New York, where a large fraction of the housing stock has no central air at all, where the population is not acclimatized, where the grid is built for occasional hot spells rather than week-long sieges. Drop a heat index of 105 or 110 onto a place that is physically and socially unprepared for it, and you get a far more dangerous situation than the same number falling on a place that has spent a century learning to live with it. The danger of a heat wave is not just the temperature, it is the gap between the temperature and what the place is ready for. And this week, that gap is widest exactly where the dome is aiming its worst. The power grid deserves its own moment here, because it is the hidden variable that can turn a dangerous heat wave into a deadly one in an instant. Air conditioning is the single most important life-saving technology during an event like this, and air conditioning runs on electricity. When tens of millions of units switch on at once and run flat out for days, especially through nights that never cool so the units never get a break, demand on the grid soars to its annual peak, and heat itself degrades the grid, making transmission lines sag and lose capacity, making transformers run hot and fail. The worst-case scenario in any major heat wave is a widespread power failure at the peak of the heat, because that pulls the life support out from under the exact people who need it most, all at once, with no quick fix. I am not forecasting that this week, but it is the reason utilities across the affected region will be on high alert, and it is one more way that the nights matter. A grid, like a body, needs the overnight hours to cool down and recover. This week, neither one gets to. And the geographic breadth is the part that makes this logistically dangerous in a way a local heatwave never is. When one city bakes, help can flow in from the cooler regions around it. Crews, supplies, mutual aid, a neighbouring grid to lean on. When the entire eastern two-thirds of the country is under the same dome at the same time, there is no cooler neighbour to lean on because everyone is stressed at once. The grid operators cannot import much spare power from a region that is also at its peak. Emergency services cannot easily borrow from a state that is also slammed. That simultaneity, the fact that this is not one city's problem, but a whole nation's at the same moment, is exactly what turns a manageable hazard into a strained one, and it is a direct consequence of just how enormous this single ridge is. The map of the heat is really a map of stolen nights, and the longer the dome sits, the deeper that debt grows. So that is the inside of the ring, the furnace under the lid. Now let us finally go to the rim, to the fire itself, and see how the very same high-pressure system that is cooking the centre is, around its edges, building an entirely different kind of disaster. Part 6. The Fire on the Rim. Let me clear something up right away because the phrase Ring of Fire means two completely different things, and I do not want you to confuse them. You have probably heard of the Ring of Fire as the great horseshoe of volcanoes and earthquake zones that wraps around the Pacific Ocean. That is a geological feature, a story of plate tectonics, and it has nothing to do with what we are talking about today. The Ring of Fire I'm describing is a weather pattern, and it gets its name from the way thunderstorms light up around the curved outer edge of a strong dome of high pressure, like a circle of flame around the rim of a great bowl. Same words, completely different beast. Today we are talking about the weather one. Here is how the fire gets lit. Remember that the dome is a mountain of high pressure, and air flows around it in a great clockwise sweep. On the northern and northwestern edge of the dome, that flow becomes a fast, focused river of wind aloft, and beneath it, closer to the ground, a powerful low-level jet, a stream of warm, moist air being flung northward out of the Gulf of Mexico. Now bring in the other player. Off to the northwest, over Montana and up into Canada, sits a low-pressure system, the opposite of the dome, a region of rising, unsettled air. The contrast between the sinking dome and the rising low, and the fast wind threading between them, creates a perfect assembly line for violent storms. Disturbances ride that assembly line one after another, and each one fires off a round of severe weather as it goes. That is the Ring of Fire. The storms are not random. They are the visible burning edge of the same lid that is baking the country's centre, and the ingredients this week are, frankly, alarming. As the dome pumps Gulf moisture north, the atmosphere over the upper Midwest is becoming explosively unstable. Forecasters are looking at instability values, a measure called convective available potential energy, climbing toward nearly 5,000 joules per kilogram over parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin and Iowa. You do not need to know the units. You just need to know that a value approaching 5,000 is the kind of number that makes severe weather forecasters sit up straight. That is a deeply, dangerously unstable atmosphere, a sky loaded with potential energy, waiting for a trigger. And there is a reason the fire concentrates where it does, along the northern and northwestern arc from the Dakotas through Minnesota and Wisconsin, rather than just anywhere around the dome. It is geography meeting physics. That northern rim is where the hot, moisture-laden air being pumped up from the Gulf runs headlong into the cooler, more unsettled air associated with that low-pressure system over Montana and Canada. It is a collision zone, a boundary, and boundaries are where the atmosphere does its most violent work, because that is where warm and cool air masses are forced together, and the warm, buoyant air is shoved upward to build storms. Layer the fast winds aloft on top of that collision, the winds that give a storm its spin and organisation, and you have assembled every ingredient a supercell needs, all in the same place, refreshed day after day as the dome holds its position. The centre of the country gets the dead, baking calm. The northern edge gets the collision. Same system, opposite faces, and the line between them is exactly where the storms march. Let me walk you through the siege day by day, because the defining feature of a Ring of Fire is that it does not strike once. It reloads. it comes back to the same regions on consecutive days. Today, the immediate threat runs across the Dakotas and into northwest Minnesota and northern Iowa, where the Storm Prediction Center has drawn a slight risk, and a severe thunderstorm watch is already flying. The main danger today is damaging straight-line wind, but watch the overnight hours, because storms firing late over western South Dakota and southern North Dakota could drop hail 2 to 3 inches across, larger than golf balls, edging toward the size of baseballs and even apples. There is even a conditional tornado threat tucked in there tonight near Bismarck and Jamestown, where a key tornado ingredient is climbing, even though the official outlook has not formally drawn a tornado area. When the deep atmosphere is this primed, a storm only needs one opening. Then comes Monday, and this is where it sharpens. A larger zone of risk stretches from northeast Nebraska up through Sioux Falls and Minneapolis into Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. With that explosive instability in place and a ferocious low-level jet streaming north, all the hazards come onto the table: very large hail, destructive wind, and tornadoes. There is real uncertainty about exactly where the worst of it lands, because it depends on precisely how far south the surface low-pressure center sets up. If it slides a little further south than expected, a dangerous setup could open up across Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. The strongest tornado ingredients sit up toward northern Minnesota and into Manitoba, but there is a sneaky conditional threat for stronger tornadoes further south. From the Sioux Falls and Omaha corridor up toward Minneapolis, if storms can break through the cap, the warm lid aloft that is trying to hold them down, it is a coiled spring of a setup. There is a detail in the Monday setup that I find genuinely fascinating, and it explains why so many of the worst plain storms strike in the evening and overnight rather than in the heat of the afternoon, which is counterintuitive. The key is that low-level jet, the river of fast, moist air streaming north out of the Gulf a few thousand feet above the ground. That jet tends to strengthen after sunset, ramping up through the night, because of the way friction with the ground falls off once daytime mixing stops. So even as the surface cools a little after dark, the atmosphere a half-mile up is being injected with a surge of moisture and energy and spin. Storms that form or survive into the evening can suddenly find themselves in a far more favourable environment than they had at noon, tapping into that strengthening jet, organising, rotating and turning dangerous in the hours when most people have stopped paying attention to the sky and gone to bed. This is also part of why this region's tornadoes are so deadly. A nocturnal tornado, hidden in the dark, striking a sleeping population, is several times more likely to kill than the same tornado in daylight. The ring of fire does not clock out at sunset. In some ways it sharpens. There is also a piece of meteorological suspense built into the Monday forecast that is worth understanding, because it is why the Outlook keeps using the word conditional. The villain and the saviour in this setup are the same thing, a layer of warm air aloft called a cap. A cap is a lid within the lid, a warm layer a few thousand feet up that suppresses storms by stopping rising air from punching through it. As long as the cap holds, the atmosphere just keeps loading with energy, hotter and more unstable by the hour, like a pressure cooker with the valve held shut. The cap is why the morning can be quiet even as the danger builds. But if something, a disturbance, a boundary, a little extra heating, breaks that cap in the late afternoon or evening, all of that stored energy is released at once, and the storms that go up do so explosively, exactly because they were held back so long. So the forecast hinges on a coin flip. If the cap holds all day, much of the region stays quiet. If it breaks, the very same air produces a small number of intense, fast-rotating supercells. That is the knife edge the forecasters are watching, and it is why they cannot give a clean answer until the day arrives. Tuesday, the threat shifts south and east into the Midwest and Central Plains, with an enhanced tornado risk near the surface low over Wisconsin, eastern Minnesota, and the Upper Peninsula. An intense cluster of storms is expected to blow up in the evening, and if any supercells fire out ahead of that cluster, the environment could support not just tornadoes, but the possibility of a strong one. And then Wednesday and Thursday, the pattern shifts again, with the upper-level flow turning more westerly, the classic setup for long, organised lines of thunderstorms to sweep across the Midwest and Great Lakes. That raises the spectre of a derecho, which is a word worth knowing. A derecho is a single, enormous, long-lived complex of thunderstorms that races in a straight line for hundreds of miles, leaving a swath of wind damage behind it that can rival a hurricane or a tornado outbreak. July is the prime season for them in this part of the country, and this pattern is exactly the kind that breeds them. Let me slow down on a couple of these hazards, because the words we use have lost their teeth through overuse, and I want to put the teeth back. When I say very large hail, 2 to 3 inches across, I want you to picture what that actually means. A 2-inch hailstone is the size of a hen's egg. A 3-inch hailstone is the size of a baseball, and some of the stones this week could push toward the size of an apple. Now picture that falling out of the sky at over 100 miles an hour. It shreds crops to stubble in seconds. It punches holes through roofs and shatters windshields. It can kill livestock caught in the open, and it can seriously injure or kill a person who cannot get to shelter. Hail of that size is not an inconvenience that dents your car. It is a barrage of ice cannonballs, and the storms capable of producing it this week, the supercells of the northern plains, are the most efficient hail factories the atmosphere knows how to build. And then there is the wind, which is the threat that will affect the most people across the most days. We throw around the phrase damaging winds so casually that it has stopped meaning anything. So here is what it means. 60 to 70 mile per hour straight-line winds, the kind these storms will repeatedly produce, are equivalent to a strong hurricane's gusts, except they arrive with almost no warning and they are dry, born of a thunderstorm collapsing and slamming. A pool of rain-cooled air down onto the ground where it spreads out in every direction. They snap mature trees, peel roofs, flip campers and small boats, and knock out power to whole counties. And in a week, when power is the difference between a safe night and a deadly one, every one of those wind-driven outages is not just an inconvenience. It is a removal of the air conditioning that the heat made essential. Do you see how the two weapons of this machine reach across and reinforce each other? The storms on the rim knock out the power that the heat in the centre makes a matter of survival. They are not separate problems, they compound. The derecho threat for the middle of the week deserves a hard look too, because it is the single hazard with the potential to affect the largest area in one stroke. A derecho is not a tornado. It is, in a sense, more frightening in its reach, because where a tornado carves a narrow path a few hundred yards wide, a derecho lays down a swathe of destructive wind that can be 100 miles wide and stretch for 600, 800, 1,000 miles before it finally dies. It is a single, self-sustaining wall of storms that feeds on the very heat and instability the dome is generating, and it can travel from the plains to the east coast in a single day, leaving millions without power in its wake. The conditions late in the work week, the building heat, the explosive instability, the westerly winds aloft are exactly the recipe. And I want to connect the derecho threat back to the heat one more time, because it is the cleanest example of how the two halves of this machine feed each other. A derecho does not run on nothing. It runs on instability, on the enormous reservoir of heat and humidity built up under and ahead of the dome. The hotter and more humid the air mass, the more fuel there is for a line of storms to organise, sustain itself and race across the map. So the very same trapped, baking, soupy air that is making the nights unbearable in the centre is the high-octane fuel that a derecho would burn on the rim. The heat is not just sitting there being miserable, it is loading the gun that the storms on the edge may eventually fire. This is what I mean when I say it is one machine. The danger in the centre and the danger on the rim are not neighbours who happen to live on the same street. They are made of the same substance, the same heat, expressed two different ways. Whether one actually forms is never certain until it does, but the ingredients are being laid out on the table, and the people who forecast these events are watching that window closely. Notice what is happening here. For day after day, the same regions of the northern plains and upper Midwest are getting reloaded, hit again and again because the dome is not moving, so the assembly line on its rim just keeps running. That is the cruelty of a stalled pattern. It is not one storm you can brace for and then recover from. It is a siege. And the reason it is happening is the same reason the east cannot cool off at night. The ridge will not budge. The lid that bakes the centre is the wheel that spins the fire around the edge. One machine, two weapons. But there is a third edge to this dome, a southern and eastern one, where the weapon is not heat and not wind, but water, and in parts of Kentucky and Indiana, that water has already turned deadly. Part 7. The Drowning Edge. While half the country bakes and the northern rim catches fire, there is a seam in this pattern where something almost opposite is happening, and it is just as dangerous. On the southern and eastern flank of the dome, a weak frontal boundary has stalled out, draped across the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, and a stalled front, in this kind of setup, becomes a set of train tracks. Let me explain what that means, because it is one of the most underestimated killers in weather. When a front stalls and the atmosphere upstream is loaded with tropical moisture, thunderstorms can form and then move along the boundary one after another, each new storm passing over the same ground as the last, like train cars running over the same stretch of track. Meteorologists call it training, and the effect is devastating, because it means a single spot can get hit by storm after storm after storm, piling up rainfall totals that no single storm could ever produce. The sky just keeps wringing itself out over the same county. That is exactly what has been happening along the Ohio River. In and around Owensboro, Kentucky, and Davis County, 2-day rainfall totals have reached 10 to 12 inches. Let that number land. 10 to 12 inches of rain in 48 hours in one place. The National Weather Service office responsible has been using the starkest language in its vocabulary, reporting that significant flooding is occurring and warning, in plain words, of life-threatening flash flooding. Just across the state line, Gibson County, Indiana has seen 2-day totals over 10 inches, with the same dangerous, widespread flash flooding. As of this forecast, there were 14 flash flood warnings, and dozens of broader flood warnings active across the country, most of them clustered right there in this corridor. To put 10 to 12 inches of rain in 48 hours in perspective, that is, in many parts of the country, a substantial fraction of what a place would normally expect in an entire summer, delivered in 2 days, onto a single area. Rivers and creeks are not built for that. They have a capacity, a volume they can carry, and when the runoff exceeds it, the water has nowhere to go but out. Over the banks, into the floodplain, which is so often where towns and roads and homes were built in the first place, because floodplains are flat and convenient, and the big floods are rare enough to forget. The Ohio River Valley has a long, hard memory of catastrophic flooding, and the communities along these smaller tributaries are the ones most exposed when the training sets up overhead, because a small creek can rise far faster and far more violently than a great river. It is the flashy, fast-rising small streams that kill, not the slow, majestic crest of the big rivers that you can see coming for days. And the timing layers a cruelty on top of the danger, the same way it does with the heat. This is a holiday week. People are travelling, camping, heading to riverside cabins and campgrounds and low-lying recreation areas precisely because it is summer and the water is the draw. A campground on a beautiful creek is paradise on a clear evening, and a death trap when 10 inches of rain falls upstream in the dark and sends a wall of water down the channel at 2 in the morning. Every year, some of the most heartbreaking flood tragedies happen exactly this way, to people who chose a spot by the water for a holiday and had no idea what was bearing down on them from miles upstream, in a watershed they could not see. If you are anywhere near these swollen creeks and rivers in the coming days, know where the high ground is and do not camp in the bottoms. And here is the part that ties it back to everything else. This flooding is not a separate weather system that happened to wander in. It is the underside of the very same dome. The high-pressure building to the southeast is pumping that deep tropical moisture northward, and where that moisture runs into the stalled front on the dome's edge, it dumps. The ground in much of this region is already saturated from earlier rounds of rain. Saturated ground cannot absorb more water, so every additional inch runs straight off into creeks and streams and low-lying roads, and the flooding gets worse with each new round, even if the rain itself is not heavier. Some of these places are forecast to pick up several more inches, and in flash flooding, it is often not the total that kills, it is the rate. A few inches in an hour over ground that cannot drink it can turn a quiet creek into a wall of water in minutes. I want to underline why flash flooding kills more people than almost any other thunderstorm hazard, year in and year out, because it is the one that people consistently underestimate, and the reason is almost always the same. It is the car. The overwhelming majority of flash flood deaths happen in vehicles, when a driver comes to a stretch of road covered in water and decides to chance it, because the water looks shallow, because they have driven that road 1,000 times because they are in a hurry. But moving water is deceptively, almost unbelievably powerful. As little as 6 inches of fast-moving water can knock an adult off their feet. As little as a foot to 2 feet of it can float and carry away most cars, including large ones. And here is the trap. You cannot see the road under the water. You cannot tell if the pavement beneath has been undercut and washed away entirely, leaving a hidden drop. By the time the car is floating, the decision has already been made for you, and you're no longer a driver, you're a passenger in a 2,000-pound boat with no controls, in the dark, in a current. The single most important sentence in flood safety is the oldest one. Turn around, do not drown. It sounds like a slogan. It is the difference between living and dying, and this week in the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, it is going to be tested over and over. The cruelty of training storms, the ones running over the same ground like cars over a track, is that they often strike at night when people are asleep and cannot see the water rising, and they strike in the same places that have already been hit, where the ground is saturated and the creeks are already swollen. A community can take one round of heavy rain and be fine. It is the second, the third, the fourth round, landing on ground that has no capacity left to absorb anything, that turns gentle creeks into torrents and quiet streets into rivers. And because the rain is so localized, the disaster is patchy and personal. One town gets 10 inches and a catastrophe. A town 20 miles up the road gets almost nothing and never understands what the fuss was about. That patchiness is part of what makes flash flooding so deadly, because the people in the bullseye often do not realize how anomalous their situation is until the water is already in the house. So step back and look at the full anatomy of this single pattern now, because it is genuinely remarkable and a little unsettling. At the centre, under the lid, a record heat wave that steals the nights. On the northern rim, a multi-day siege of severe storms, hail, wind and tornadoes. On the southern edge, training thunderstorms and life-threatening flash floods. And, as we'll see in a moment, on the western flank, dangerous fire weather and even an out-of-season freeze. 4 different kinds of disaster, in 4 different parts of the country, all at the same time, all spun off the same enormous stalled ridge of high pressure. This is what I meant at the very beginning when I said these are not separate stories. They are one machine seen from 4 different sides. It is worth sitting for a moment with how unusual it is to see this much, this varied, all at once. On a typical summer day in the United States, you might have a heat advisory in one region, a severe storm risk in another, a flood watch somewhere else, scattered and unrelated, the ordinary background noise of a big country's weather. What is happening this week is different in kind, not just degree. These hazards are not scattered and unrelated. They are arranged, organized, radiating outward from a single center like spokes from a hub. When you can draw a line from the flooding in Kentucky to the heat in St. Louis, to the hail in South Dakota to the fire weather in Colorado, and have every one of those lines meet at the same dome of high pressure, you're not looking at a busy weather day. You're looking at a single, coherent, continent-scale event wearing several different masks. And that, more than any individual record, is what makes this one worth understanding rather than just enduring. And the obvious question, the one that decides how this all ends, is simple. How long does the machine run, and where does it go next? Because a stalled pattern, by definition, has to break eventually. The question is whether it breaks cleanly, or whether it does something far stranger first. Part 8. When the dome walks west. Here is where the forecast stops being a description of the present and becomes a genuine mystery about the next move, and it is the part I find most fascinating, because the guidance is hinting that this dome may not simply sit still until it weakens and fades. It may do something that runs against our every intuition about weather. It may walk backward. We are all taught correctly that weather in the middle latitudes generally moves from west to east. The jet stream flows that way, and our storms and fronts ride along with it. So when a meteorologist tells you a system is going to move the other way, from east to west, your instinct should be that something unusual is going on. That backward motion has a name. It is called retrograde movement, and strong blocking ridges, the stuck kind we are dealing with here, are exactly the features capable of doing it. A block can become so dominant that it stops obeying the normal eastward flow and instead lurches westward, dragging its weather with it. And that is what the trend in the model suggests could happen later in the holiday weekend and into the following week. Instead of the dome holding over the east and then breaking down in place, it may slide or retrograde toward the west. If it does, the consequences reshuffle the entire map. For the East Coast, a westward slide of the dome would actually bring some relief, allowing cooler, less oppressive air and probably a more unsettled, stormier pattern to nudge in behind it. But for the middle of the country, it means the opposite. The extreme heat would expand westward into the plains, the Mississippi Valley, and the interior west. And those regions would just keep on baking, taking their turn under the lid while the east finally exhales. This is why the people who do this for a living are uneasy about the period right around and after the 4th of July. The models genuinely disagree. The European model has been persistent in showing a messy, stormy, unsettled pattern developing across the eastern United States as the dome shifts, with lines of thunderstorms breaking out, while the American model has been more muted. When the two major global models split like that, it is an honest signal that the atmosphere is at a decision point, and the outcome is not yet locked. The Climate Prediction Center has already gone so far as to highlight a slight risk of heavy rain across part of the country in the few days following the 4th, which tells you that the official forecasters are taking the stormier, wetter evolution seriously. So we have layered uncertainty here, and I want to be honest about it rather than pretend I can tell you exactly what the holiday weekend holds 10 days out. What is high confidence is the heat itself through the middle of the work week, and the multi-day severe weather siege on the northern rim. That much is locked in. What is lower confidence, what we genuinely have to watch, is the endgame. Does the dome hold and bake the east through the holiday, then break? Does it retrograde west and pass the misery to the centre of the country? And does a stormier, wetter pattern then come crashing into the east just as the heat finally lets go, trading one hazard for another? There is a strange, almost folkloric piece of the Midwest humidity story worth mentioning here, because it surprises people and it is real. In the heart of corn country, in states like Iowa, the crops themselves contribute to the humidity during a heat wave, through a process farmers and forecasters half-jokingly call corn sweat. A single acre of corn can release thousands of gallons of water into the air for the course of a day through transpiration, the plant equivalent of sweating, as it pulls moisture from the soil and breathes it out through its leaves. Multiply that across millions of acres of densely planted corn at the peak of the growing season, which is exactly where we are on the calendar, and you get a measurable boost to the local humidity, enough to nudge the dew points higher and push the heat index up a few extra, dangerous degrees. It is a small reminder that the landscape itself is part of the weather machine, that the same warmth driving the dome is also driving the corn to breathe harder, which thickens the air, which makes the nights more oppressive. Everything in this pattern feeds back into everything else. It also helps to remember that retrograding westward walking blocks are not some theoretical curiosity. They have happened before, and when they do, they tend to produce exactly this kind of drawn-out, shifting misery, where one region after another takes its turn under the heat as the block lurches the wrong way across the map. That is part of why a retrograde scenario this time would be so consequential. It would not end the event. It would relocate it, prolong it, and spread the damage across more of the country before it finally let go. A clean breakdown, where the block simply weakens in place and a normal progressive pattern returns, would actually be the kinder outcome. The fear is not that the dome holds. The fear is that it holds and then walks, dragging the danger into new territory while the east only gets a partial reprieve traded for storms. There is even one more wrinkle riding the edge of all this, and it is worth a brief mention because it shows how interconnected the pattern is. The same ridge positioning that steers the heat is also nudging moisture off the southeastern coast, and the National Hurricane Center has flagged that a broad area of low pressure could try to form offshore of the southeast early in the week, with some slow potential to develop into something tropical. The odds are low right now, and I want to stress that this is a thing to watch, not a thing to fear yet. The major ensembles mostly keep the probability modest. What makes that offshore possibility worth even a passing mention is the way it would interact with everything else. We are still very early in the Atlantic hurricane season, and the waters off the southeast coast are plenty warm enough to support development if a spin can organise and hold together. The same ridge that is steering our weather is the feature that would help nudge any such system, and a strong ridge can act like a wall, shoving a developing storm in one direction or another depending on exactly where its edge sits. So even this low-odds tropical wrinkle is not really a separate story either. It is the dome reaching a hand out over the ocean. I am not telling you a storm is coming. The odds right now are genuinely low, and most of the guidance keeps it weak or keeps it offshore. I am telling you to notice how every thread in this week's weather traces back to the same enormous structure, even the ones way out over the water. That is the real point. Once you see the machine, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere. But it is a reminder that this dome is not just sitting there. It is actively reaching out and stirring the waters at its edges, and where it pushes that moisture next is part of the same unfolding story. It is worth being honest about why forecasting the endgame of a blocking pattern is so genuinely hard, because it gets at something humbling about the limits of even our best science. Forecasting the day-to-day weather inside a stable pattern is something we have become remarkably good at. We can tell you with real skill what tomorrow and the next day hold. But forecasting how and when a block breaks down is a different and much harder problem, because the breakdown depends on small disturbances arriving from far upstream, often from over the Pacific or even Asia, days in advance, and on exactly how those disturbances interact with the block when they arrive. A tiny difference in the timing or strength of an incoming wave can be the difference between a block that holds for 3 more days and one that collapses or retrogrades or reorganizes into something new. This is the realm where the models genuinely diverge, where the European guidance and the American guidance can paint meaningfully different pictures of the same weekend, and where any forecaster who tells you they know exactly what the period after the 4th holds is overselling. The honest position is to lay out the possibilities, attach rough confidence to each, and watch. What we can say with confidence is the structure of the uncertainty, which is itself useful. The high confidence window is the next several days, the heat building to its peak and the severe siege on the rim. That is locked. The lower confidence window is the holiday weekend and beyond, where the central question is the dome's next move, hold or retrograde, and whether a wetter, stormier regime then takes over the east. And the lowest confidence thread of all is that offshore tropical possibility, which is a genuine maybe, not a forecast. Knowing which parts of a forecast are solid and which are soft is not a weakness. It is the most important thing a forecaster can tell you, because it tells you what to act on now and what to simply keep an eye on. Act on the heat and the storms this week. Keep an eye on the holiday weekend. That is the honest division. So the dome is not a static thing. It is a living, moving system with a center, 4 burning edges, and a next move that even the best models cannot fully agree on. Which raises a deeper question than any single forecast can answer. Why is a pattern like this happening at all, in a year when, by one important measure, the conditions should be relatively calm? To answer that, we have to step back from the week and look at the larger stage this is all playing out on. Part 9. The stage this is playing out on. Here is something that should genuinely give you pause. The natural climate pattern that we usually blame for our most extreme global heat is, right now, not even switched on. I'm talking about El Niño, the periodic warming of the Central and Eastern Pacific Ocean that tends to crank up global temperatures and load the dice toward heat records. When a strong El Niño is running, ferocious heat is, in a sense, expected. It is the loud, obvious culprit. But look at where we actually are. The index that measures this, the Oceanic Niño Index, currently sits at about positive 0.48. In the formal language of the forecasters, that is neutral. We are not in an El Niño. We are in the in-between zone, the neutral state, where neither El Niño nor its cool sister La Niña is in charge. And yet here we are, with the government using the words record-breaking, with a dome strong enough to draw exclamation points out of career meteorologists, with dozens of nighttime heat records in play across half a continent. The loud culprit is not even in the room, and the house is still on fire. Now, there is a nuance, and it matters. The Pacific is not just neutral, it is neutral and warming. Over the past 6 seasons, that index has climbed steadily, swinging from clearly negative, around negative 0.55, up to its current positive value, with the key region of the Pacific running a sea surface temperature around 28 degrees Celsius. So the ocean is trending warm, leaning toward a future El Niño, but it has not arrived. We are getting record-threatening heat from a Pacific that is merely warming up, that has not yet thrown its real punch, and that should reframe the entire week for you. Because if a neutral, only gently warming Pacific can already help manufacture a heat wave that refuses to cool down at night across the eastern half of the country, then the obvious and unsettling question is what happens when the next true, strong El Niño actually arrives, stacked on top of everything else. We are seeing what the warmed-up baseline can do on an ordinary year. The extraordinary years are still ahead. That word, baseline, is the honest center of this whole story, and I want to handle it carefully, because this is where the conversation usually goes off the rails in both directions. The background climate has warmed by something like 1.3 to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to a century and a half ago. That does not sound like much, but there is a hard piece of physics, worked out in the 1800s and not seriously disputed since, that says warmer air holds more moisture, roughly 7% more for every degree Celsius of warming. More moisture in the air means higher heat index values, because it is the humidity that makes the heat lethal, and it means more water available to dump when those training storms set up over Kentucky. The warming does not create these patterns. The jet stream buckles into ridges and troughs all on its own and always has. What the warming does is load the dice. It makes the hot extreme a little hotter, the wet extreme a little wetter, the records a little easier to break and the nights a little harder to cool. It is an amplifier on a natural signal, and because I know that whenever a dramatic, well-forecast weather pattern lines up with a major holiday, a particular set of claims starts to circulate, let me address them head-on, the way this channel always tries to. Every time something like this happens, you will see people insisting that the weather is being engineered, that some agency is using a device like HARP, or cloud seeding, or some secret geoengineering program to build this dome, or to ruin the holiday, or to manipulate events. I understand the instinct. When the timing is this dramatic, it can feel like it must be deliberate. But the physics simply does not allow it, and it is not close. Consider the energy involved. A continental scale ridge of high pressure like this one contains an amount of energy that is almost impossible to overstate, vastly beyond the entire output of human civilization, let alone any single device or program. The notion that a radio transmitter or a fleet of planes scattering particles could build, steer, or hold a feature this size is off by so many orders of magnitude that it does not survive even a back-of-the-envelope check. Cloud seeding, the one weather modification technique that actually does something real, can under narrow conditions coax a little extra precipitation out of clouds that already exist. It cannot conjure a 600 decameter ridge or bend the jet stream across a continent. The honest and frankly more humbling truth is that no one is driving this. It is a naturally buckled jet stream, sitting and grinding, made marginally more extreme by a warmed baseline. There is no operator, there is no off switch. And in a strange way, that is more sobering than any conspiracy, because a machine no one controls is a machine no one can simply turn off for us. I actually understand why the engineered weather idea is so appealing, and I do not say that to mock anyone, because the instinct behind it is human and even reasonable. When something this large and this precisely timed bears down on you, the idea that it is random, that no one is in control, that it is just physics grinding along indifferent to whether it ruins your holiday or takes your grandmother, is genuinely harder to accept than the idea that someone, somewhere, is doing it on purpose. A villain is, strangely comforting, because a villain implies control, and control implies that someone could stop it, or be stopped, or at least be blamed. The truth, that this is an enormous, unguided machine that no one built and no one can switch off, is more frightening precisely because it removes the villain. There is no one to call, no lever to pull. There is only understanding the machine well enough to get out of its way and protect the people who cannot. I would rather hand you that harder truth than a comforting lie, because the harder truth is the one that actually keeps you safe. There is an equal and opposite error I want to flag too, because intellectual honesty cuts both ways. Just as it's wrong to claim this is engineered, it is also wrong to claim this single heat wave is by itself proof of imminent doom, or to swing the other way and dismiss it as nothing, just summer being summer. Both of those are lazy. The accurate framing is the boring, true one in the middle. This is a genuinely extreme but physically ordinary ridge, the kind the atmosphere has always been capable of producing, occurring on a baseline that has been nudged warmer, which is why it is flirting with records it would not have touched a few decades ago. Hold both halves of that in your head at once, and you understand this week better than almost anyone shouting about it online. I want to spend one more moment on the science of how we even know the baseline is the culprit, and not the whole story, because this is where careful researchers have actually done remarkable work, and it is more honest than either side of the shouting usually admits. There is now an entire field devoted to what is called attribution, where scientists take a specific extreme event, run the climate simulations many times over with and without the warming we have already added, and ask a precise question. How much more likely and how much more intense did the warming make this particular event? The answer for heat waves is consistently the clearest of any weather extreme, because heat is the most directly connected to a warmer baseline. These studies repeatedly find that the kind of heat we are seeing has been made meaningfully more likely and meaningfully hotter by the warmed baseline, often by a large factor. Notice what that does and does not say. It does not say the warming created the ridge. The jet stream would have buckled anyway. Blocks have always formed. This exact pattern has precedents going back as far as our records reach. What it says is that when the pattern does form, it now plays out on a warmer stage, so it reaches higher, breaks more records, and steals more nights than the identical pattern would have a few decades ago. The dice were always going to be rolled. We have quietly weighted them, and there is good research too on the stuck jet stream piece. The question of whether these blocking patterns themselves are becoming more common or more persistent. This is genuinely harder to pin down than the heat attribution. An honest scientist will tell you the evidence is more mixed and the debate more open. Some careful studies have found signals that the kind of double jet and amplified wave configurations that lock heat domes in place have become more frequent over parts of the Northern Hemisphere in recent decades. Others urge caution, noting that the natural variability of the jet stream is enormous and the record is short. I am not going to pretend to you that this part is settled, because it is not, and you should be suspicious of anyone who claims it is, in either direction. What I can say is that the heat part is about as solid as climate science gets, and the jet stream part is an active, legitimate frontier. Holding those two confidence levels separately, being sure about what we are sure about and honest about what we are not, is exactly the kind of intellectual discipline this channel is built on. Even the cold tells the same story. On the far western, trough side of this pattern, the underbelly of the same dipole, there were 17 red flag warnings posted for critical fire weather, with high-intensity fires already burning in southwest Colorado and well over 1,000 active fire hotspots across the country. While at the very same time, in the high country of Nevada, the forecasters had to issue an out-of-season freeze warning, with temperatures dropping toward freezing in late June. Fire and frost in the same week, in the same western third of the country, both of them the direct product of the cold trough that is the necessary other half of the hot ridge baking the east. And that western fire weather is its own slow danger riding the same pattern. The trough out west brings not just cooler air, but gusty winds and bone-dry humidity to terrain that, in many places, is already primed to burn after a dry stretch. Strong wind plus single-digit humidity plus available fuel is the recipe for explosive fire growth, which is why those 17 red flag warnings were posted, and why the fires already burning in southwest Colorado had the attention of the people who track them. A fire that starts on a red flag day can run faster than a person, and the same dome that is baking the east and feeding the storms on its rim is, on its far western flank, fanning the conditions that turn a stray spark into a catastrophe. It is worth holding all of this in your head at once, because it is genuinely rare and genuinely instructive. One pattern: heat in the centre, storms on the northern rim, floods on the southern edge, fire and frost on the western flank. Not 4 coincidences. One machine showing you every face it has, all in the same week. The dipole has 2 poles. We spend all our attention on the hot one, but the cold one is right there, proving the whole machine is real. Let me push on that idea of the warming Pacific a little harder, because I think it is the most quietly important fact in this entire forecast, and it is the one that turns a weather story into something larger. El Niño and La Niña are not just abstractions for forecasters. They are the single biggest natural lever on year-to-year global temperature. In an El Niño year, a huge expanse of the Pacific surrenders its stored heat to the atmosphere, and global temperatures jump. The hottest years in the modern record have almost always been El Niño years for exactly this reason. La Niña years, when the Pacific pulls heat down into its depths, tend to run cooler. And right now, we are in neither. We are in the lukewarm middle, the neutral state, with the lever sitting roughly at centre, neither helping nor hurting much. So sit with the implication one more time, because it is genuinely sobering. The heat this week, the record-threatening, night-stealing, half a continent heat, is being produced with that great natural lever sitting in neutral. The biggest natural amplifier of heat that the planet possesses is not engaged. It is idling. and the trend is that it is slowly shifting toward the warm side, toward a future El Niño that, when it comes, will add its enormous push on top of the warmed baseline we already have. We are watching what an ordinary neutral year can do to a country, and we are being told by the physics that this is not the strong version. This is the calm before the lever even moves. If you have ever wondered what people mean when they say the floor is rising, this is it, made concrete. The thing we are calling extreme this week is becoming the new ordinary, and the genuinely extreme is still out there in the years ahead, waiting for the Pacific to finish turning. So that is the stage, a warmed baseline, a neutral but warming Pacific holding its real punch in reserve, a naturally buckled jet stream sitting still and grinding, no villain at the controls, just physics, amplified. And maybe that is the quietly unsettling thing to carry out of all this science. We tend to want our disasters to have authors, because an author can be reasoned with, or stopped, or at least understood as malicious rather than indifferent. But the dome has no author. It is the blind output of air and heat and rotation doing what air and heat and rotation have always done. Only now on a floor we have slowly raised beneath them. There is a strange dignity in facing that honestly, in refusing both the comfort of a villain and the comfort of denial, and simply saying, here is the machine, here is how it works, here is what it is about to do, and here is how we protect each other from it. That is the whole job. Which leaves us with the only question that really matters, the one this entire forecast has been building toward. Part 10. Here is what comes next. So let me bring the whole machine back into one frame, and then tell you the honest answer to the question in the title, which is, here is what comes next. What comes next in the near term is high confidence and not good. Through the start and middle of this work week, the dome holds, and the heat builds toward its peak across the central and eastern United States day after day, with the nights refusing to cool. On the northern rim, the ring of fire keeps reloading, round after round of severe storms across the plains and the upper Midwest, with a threat of very large hail, destructive winds, tornadoes, and by midweek the real possibility of a derecho carving its way across the region. On the southern edge, the training storms and the flash flooding continue over already saturated ground. That much is, as close as the atmosphere ever gets to certain, locked in. If you live anywhere under this dome or along its rim, the next several days are the ones to take seriously. What comes after that, around and just past the 4th of July, is the genuine mystery, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The dome may hold over the east and then break. It may retrograde, walk westward, and hand the heat to the middle of the country, while a stormier, wetter pattern crashes into the east. The best models in the world disagree on the details, and that disagreement is itself the honest forecast. We are at a decision point in the atmosphere, and we will simply have to watch it resolve. But underneath the week-to-week forecast, there is a larger answer to what comes next, and it is the one I actually want to leave you with. Because the real lesson of this pattern is not in any single storm or any single 110-degree afternoon. It is in the nights. For most of human history, the deal we struck with summer was simple. The day could punish you, but the night would let you recover. That nightly reset was so reliable that we built our bodies, our cities, and our expectations around it. The dome forming over America this week breaks that ancient deal. It does not just turn up the heat of the day, it cancels the mercy of the night, and it does it not in some distant theoretical future, but right now, in a year when the Pacific has not even fully woken up, when the loudest natural amplifier of heat is still switched off. This is the floor, not the ceiling. This is what an ordinary year looks like on the warmed baseline we have already built. I think it is worth naming what adaptation to this future actually looks like, because the story does not have to end in helplessness, and I do not want to leave you only with dread. The cities that have studied their heat disasters have learned real lessons and saved real lives. After 1995, Chicago built systems it did not have before, networks to identify and check on, isolated elderly residents during heat emergencies, public cooling centres, coordinated warnings, a recognition that heat is a disaster that requires a response the way a flood or a blizzard does. Those measures work. The death tolls in later heat waves, in cities that took the lesson seriously, came down. Heat is, in a strange way, one of the most survivable major hazards we face, because the defences are so simple and so cheap, a cool room, a glass of water, a phone call to someone who lives alone. The technology to survive a heatwave is not exotic. It is air conditioning, electricity, and human attention. The tragedy of heat deaths is that almost every single one is preventable, which is also the hope buried inside it. We know exactly how to stop this. We just have to actually do it, in advance, every time, especially for the people on the margins. And that word advance is really what the title of this video is pointing at. Here is what comes next is not only a question about the weather models, it is a question about us, about whether we treat a forecast like this as a curiosity to scroll past or as a warning to act on. The dome is coming whether we are ready or not. The nights are going to stay warm whether we are ready or not. The only variable we actually control is the readiness, and readiness is almost entirely a matter of what we do in the days before, not the days during. Stocking water, testing the air conditioner before the peak, not during it, when repair crews are overwhelmed, identifying the vulnerable person on your street now, while it is still easy, instead of discovering them later when it is not. The grim arithmetic of every heat disaster is that the deaths cluster among people who are one phone call, one open door, one working fan away from surviving. The forecast gives us the days of warning. What we do with them is the whole story. So here is the question I want to leave ringing in your ears, the one that should outlast this particular week of weather. We have always believed that no matter how brutal the day, we could count on the night to bring relief. But what happens to a country, to its oldest and most vulnerable people, to its power grid, to the simple human habit of sleeping with the windows open when the night stops cooling down? Not once, in a freak event, but a little more often, a little more reliably, every summer that comes. The ring of fire closing around America this week will open again in a few days. The heat will break, the storms will scatter, the records will be tallied and forgotten by most. But the question it is asking will not go away, because the most dangerous thing in this entire forecast was never the blazing afternoon that everyone can see. It was the quiet 85-degree darkness that almost no one is talking about. And that darkness is not leaving. It is just getting started. I started this video by telling you that a wall was being built around the middle of the country and that you could not see it. I hope that by now you can. I hope that when you walk outside this week into a beautiful, cloudless, blistering afternoon, you will understand that you're standing inside a machine, under a lid, on the warmed floor of a Pacific that has not even thrown its real punch yet. I hope that when the storms reload on the northern plains for the third day running, you will see them not as separate bad luck, but as the burning edge of that same lid. And I hope that when the sun finally goes down on the 4th of July and the air refuses to cool, you will know that this quiet, warm, sleepless darkness is the part of the whole spectacle that actually matters, the part that decides who is still here to watch next year's fireworks. Because in the end, that is what this channel is for, not to frighten you, but to hand you the machine, gear by gear, so that the next time you hear the word heat wave on the news and feel the urge to shrug it off as just another hot week, something in you will pause and remember. Remember the bucket that never drains. Remember the cities that learned this in 1995 and 2021. Remember that the danger is in the night, and that the defense is a glass of water, a cool room, and a knock on a neighbor's door. The ring of fire will close and it will open again. The dome will build and it will break. But the lesson it is carrying does not melt away with the heat. It stays. And the people who understand it are the people who get everyone they love through to the other side. Watch the nights, check on your neighbors, and get ready, because this is the shape of the summers to come.